I never expected anyone to witness my midnight ritual. The kitchen had become my sanctuary during those late hours when the world felt too quiet and my mind too loud. Our apartment settled into darkness around 11, but I remained awake, drawn to the solitude that only existed after Nolan disappeared into his room with textbooks and the soft glow of his laptop screen bleeding under his door. The single lamp above the sink cast everything in amber shadows. Dishes from dinner sat unwashed in the basin, testament to our shared inability to maintain any semblance of adult responsibility. My literature textbooks lay scattered across the small dining table we'd salvaged from someone's curb, their pages marked with highlighter and desperate late-night annotations. But none of that mattered when I slipped my headphones over my ears and let the music wash through me. Dancing had always been private for me, something I discovered accidentally during high school when I found myself moving to songs while alone in my childhood bedroom. It wasn't graceful or trained or anything that deserved an audience. It was simply necessary, the way breathing becomes necessary when you've held your breath too long. In our cramped kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of college life, I could let my body find its rhythm without explanation or apology. That night, I moved to something slow and haunting, a song I discovered buried in a playlist I'd been curating for months. My feet found the worn linoleum in patterns that made sense only to me, arms lifting and falling with a melody that existed only in my headphones. I was clumsy in the way that private moments allow us to be, stumbling slightly as I turned, catching myself on the counter with a quiet laugh that no one else could hear. There was something honest about those movements, something I couldn't access during daylight hours when I was busy being the version of myself that fit comfortably into lecture halls and study groups. In the kitchen's half-light, I could be raw and unguarded, letting the music pull emotions from places I kept carefully locked away during rational hours. I closed my eyes, losing myself in the space between one song and the next, when the sound of keys in the front door cut through my private world. The music continued in my headphones, but my body froze mid-movement, one arm still raised, caught in the vulnerability of being seen. Nolan stepped through the doorway, gym bag slung over his shoulder, that particular exhaustion that comes after late workouts still clinging to his frame. His t-shirt was damp with sweat, dark patches spreading across the gray fabric, and his hair stuck to his forehead in the way that should have looked disheveled, but somehow made him appear more real, more present than his usual carefully arranged self. He paused in the entryway, taking in the scene before him. I yanked my headphones free, the sudden silence of the apartment rushing in to fill the space where music had been. The embarrassment hit immediately, that particular mortification of being caught in a moment meant for no one else. I expected him to laugh, to make some joke about my late-night dancing, to treat it as the kind of amusing roommate quirk we could reference later. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something in his eyes that looked almost like recognition, as if he discovered something he hadn't known he was looking for. "You're actually not bad," he said, and his voice carried none of the teasing I'd braced myself for. The words hung between us, unexpectedly sincere, and I felt something shift in the air of our small apartment. I laughed, the sound too sharp in the quiet space, and moved to collect my headphones from where they'd fallen. "Thanks," I said, aiming for casual dismissal. "Sorry if I woke you up. I know the floors are thin." But Nolan didn't move from the doorway. His gym bag slipped from his shoulder to the floor with a soft thud, and he continued watching me with that same unreadable intensity. "You think you could teach me?" The question landed between us like something physical, something we could both see and neither could ignore. I looked up from untangling my headphone cord, expecting to find the half-smile that usually accompanied his jokes, but his expression remained serious, almost curious. I laughed again, still hoping to deflect whatever this moment was becoming. "I don't think you want dance lessons from me, Nolan. I'm not exactly trained or anything." "No, I'm serious," he said, and took a step closer. The space between us diminished, and suddenly I could smell the lingering scent of whatever soap he used at the gym, mixed with something that was purely him. "I was invited to this party next weekend. There's going to be dancing, and I'm terrible at it. Like embarrassingly bad. He ran his hand through his damp hair, a gesture I'd seen him make countless times, but which felt different now, charged with something I couldn't name. "I watch you move," he continued. "You make it look natural. Easy." The words settled in my chest like something warm and dangerous. I'd spent months living alongside Nolan, carefully cataloging the small details of his presence while maintaining the careful distance that friendship required. The way he hummed while making coffee in the morning. How he always left his textbooks open on the couch, as if he might return to them at any moment. The particular laugh he reserved for moments when he thought no one was listening. But this felt different. This felt like he'd been watching me too, cataloging his own set of details I'd never imagined he'd noticed. "I don't know," I said, the words coming out quieter than I'd intended. "I mean, I just dance for myself. It's not really something I teach." Nolan stepped closer again, close enough that I had to tilt my head back slightly to maintain eye contact. "Come on," he said, and now there was something almost pleading in his voice. "I'll make dinner for a week if you do it. I'll finally clean the bathroom. I'll do whatever you want." The offer should have been funny, should have broken whatever tension was building between us, but instead it only made the moment feel more serious, more real, because underneath his words I could hear something else, something that sounded almost like desperation. I found myself nodding before I'd fully decided to agree, drawn forward by the earnestness in his expression and the way the kitchen light caught the exhaustion around his eyes. "Okay," I said. "Okay, we can try." The smile that spread across his face was unlike any I'd seen from him before. It wasn't his usual easy charm or the practiced expression he wore for professors and classmates. It was something unguarded and genuinely grateful, and it made my chest tighten with an emotion I wasn't prepared to examine too closely. "When do we start?" he asked, and the simple question felt loaded with implications neither of us was ready to voice. I gestured vaguely at the cleared space where I'd been dancing moments before. "I guess we could start now, if you want. The music is still here." But as I moved to retrieve my phone and restart the playlist, I realized that everything had already changed. What had been my private sanctuary was about to become shared space, and the careful distance I'd maintained was about to collapse entirely. Standing there in our dimly lit kitchen, surrounded by the mundane evidence of our shared life, I understood that I was about to teach Nolan something I'd never taught anyone. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in the place where I kept thoughts too dangerous to examine, I wondered what he might teach me in return. Our apartment existed in that liminal space between adolescence and adulthood, furnished with the kind of mismatched pieces that accumulate when two 21-year-olds try to create a home without really knowing what home means yet. The couch had come from Nolan's childhood bedroom, a deep blue sectional that had seen better years but still held the shape of countless late nights. Above it hung a poster we'd found rolled up in my moving boxes, something abstract and vaguely intellectual that neither of us particularly liked, but that filled the empty wall space. The coffee table bore permanent rings from mugs we'd forgotten to use coasters for, and the bookshelf in the corner held an eclectic mix of my literature anthologies and Nolan's business textbooks, their spines creating an odd conversation between Kerouac and corporate strategy guides. Laundry baskets lived in corners where they didn't belong, perpetually half empty, because neither of us had mastered the rhythm of domestic responsibility. This was where we'd learned to exist together over the past 8 months, in a space that had become familiar through accumulated small rituals. Nolan always left his keys on the kitchen counter in the exact same spot, creating a tiny archipelago of everyday objects: wallet, phone, whatever pen he'd been chewing during his last class. I kept my notebooks stacked on the dining table, their pages filled with marginalia that grew more desperate as deadlines approached. We'd chosen each other pragmatically, through a housing board posting that had been refreshingly honest about expectations and pet peeves. But what had started as convenient cohabitation had evolved into something more complex, a friendship built on late-night conversations about everything except the things that mattered most. We developed an easy rhythm of mock arguments about whose turn it was to buy groceries, shared meals eaten while standing at the kitchen counter, and comfortable silences that stretched through Sunday afternoons. Nolan moved through the world differently than I did. He had that particular confidence that comes from always fitting where you're supposed to fit, the ease of someone who'd never questioned whether he belonged in the spaces he occupied. He was studying business with the kind of focused ambition that suggested he'd always known exactly what his life would look like. His friends called at all hours, voices spilling through his phone in easy laughter, planning parties and study groups, and weekend trips I heard about only in fragments. He was beautiful in the unconscious way that some people are, carrying himself with an athlete's natural grace, even when he was just padding around the apartment in sweatpants and old t-shirts. His hair fell across his forehead when he read, and he had a habit of running his hand through it when he was concentrating that I'd probably noticed more than I should have. For me, the apartment had become both sanctuary and subtle torment. It was the place where I could spread my books across every surface, where I could write terrible poetry at 3 in the morning without judgment, where I could exist as the version of myself that didn't have to perform for professors or classmates. But it was also the place where I lived in constant proximity to someone who had become the subject of thoughts I couldn't afford to examine too closely. I started noticing things about him that felt dangerous to notice. The way he sang along to songs he thought no one could hear. How he always made enough coffee for both of us, even when we hadn't spoken that morning. The particular laugh he had when something genuinely surprised him, different from his social laugh, more open and unguarded. These observations accumulated like evidence of something I couldn't name and didn't want to confront. Literature had always been my refuge, the place where I could lose myself in other people's carefully constructed worlds. My notebooks filled with analyses of longing and desire as literary devices, scholarly examinations of subtext, and hidden meaning that felt safer than acknowledging the subtext in my own life. I wrote poems I would never show anyone, fragments of feeling disguised as academic exercise. Nolan carried his own shadows, though he wore them less visibly. There were nights when he came home from parties earlier than expected, settling into the couch with a quiet that felt different from contentment. Sometimes his phone would buzz with texts he'd glance at and ignore, and I learned not to ask about the girlfriend whose name appeared occasionally in conversation, but never with any real warmth. He had a way of staring out our single living room window during those quiet moments, looking at something beyond the small courtyard and chain-link fence that bordered our complex. In those moments, he seemed younger somehow, less certain of the trajectory he'd always seemed so sure of. We never talked about the deeper things, the questions that lived beneath our easy friendship. Our conversations stayed safely in the territory of shared complaints about professors, debates about whose turn it was to clean the bathroom, gentle teasing about each other's habits. But there were moments when the conversation would pause, when something heavier would settle between us, and we'd both find reasons to busy ourselves with other things. The apartment held all of this, our careful dance of proximity and distance, the accumulation of months spent learning how to live alongside each other without ever really talking about what that meant. It was a space filled with unspoken questions and careful boundaries, where we'd both learned to exist comfortably with what we weren't saying. Now, standing in our kitchen with his request hanging between us, I understood that all of those careful boundaries were about to shift in ways neither of us was prepared for. The catalyst came on a Thursday evening, 3 days after that first conversation in our kitchen. Nolan had been quieter than usual, distracted in the way that meant something was weighing on him. I'd learned to recognize the signs over our months of living together. The way he'd start sentences and then trail off, the particular rhythm of his footsteps when he was pacing in his room, the silence that felt different from contentment. He found me in the living room, surrounded by books and highlighted articles for a paper I was pretending to work on. The words on the page had been blurring together for the better part of an hour, my mind drifting to places I'd been trying to avoid since our late-night encounter. When he appeared in the doorway, I could tell immediately that whatever had been bothering him was about to surface. "I got invited to something," he said, settling onto the couch beside me with the careful distance we'd always maintained. His presence shifted the air in the room, made me hyper-aware of the space between us and the way his knee almost brushed against mine when he turned to face me. "The party was at Sarah's place," he explained, for her birthday. The mention of her name carried its usual complexity, the weight of a relationship that existed more in obligation than genuine connection. I'd pieced together fragments of their history over months of careful non-conversations, understood that she represented something safe and expected in his life, even if it didn't seem to bring him any real joy. "There's going to be dancing," he continued, and the words came out with a particular kind of dread that made something shift in my chest. Real dancing, not just standing around with drinks. He ran his hand through his hair, that gesture I'd cataloged without meaning to, and I could see the genuine anxiety underneath his usual composed exterior. Nolan was accustomed to moving through social situations with natural confidence, and the prospect of being genuinely awkward in public clearly unsettled him in ways he wasn't used to navigating. "I'm terrible at it," he said, looking directly at me with an honesty that felt sudden and disarming. Like, embarrassingly bad. The kind of bad that becomes a story people tell at other parties. There was something vulnerable in his admission that made me want to reach out, to offer comfort in ways that would have crossed the careful boundaries we'd established. Instead, I closed my textbook and gave him my full attention, recognizing that this conversation was heading somewhere more significant than typical roommate consultation. "You're probably not as bad as you think," I said, though I realized I'd never actually seen him in any social situation that required that kind of physical coordination. Our friendship existed in the quiet spaces of shared meals and late-night conversations, not in the kinds of public settings where dancing happened naturally. "No, seriously," he said, and now there was something almost pleading in his voice. "I've been thinking about it for days. I can't just not go, but I also can't show up and make a fool of myself." He was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands in a way that suggested he was gathering courage for something. Then he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something that seemed to hover between hope and uncertainty. "You dance," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I've seen you. That night in the kitchen. You move like you know what you're doing, like it's natural for you." The reference to that private moment made heat rise in my face. I've been trying not to think too much about what it meant that he'd watched me, what it meant that he'd noticed something about the way I moved that I'd never shown anyone else. "Come on," he continued, and now his voice carried a different quality, something that sounded genuinely desperate. "Teach me, please. I'll do anything you want. Cook dinner for a month. Finally organize that bookshelf. Clean the bathroom without being asked." The offers should have been amusing, the kind of roommate negotiation we'd engaged in countless times over household responsibilities. But there was something in his expression that made it clear this was more than casual bargaining. There was a real need in his voice, something that went deeper than simple anxiety about a social gathering. "I don't know," I said, because the idea of being that close to him, of guiding his movements and sharing the kind of physical intimacy, felt both thrilling and dangerous. "I mean, I'm not trained or anything. I just dance for myself. That's exactly why I want you to teach me," he said, leaning forward slightly in a way that made the distance between us feel suddenly smaller. "Why I watched you that night. You weren't trying to impress anyone or look a certain way. You were just moving because it felt right." His words settled in my chest like something warm and precarious. The idea that he'd been observing me closely enough to understand something fundamental about what dancing meant to me felt more intimate than any conversation we'd ever had. "Please, Caleb," he said, and the use of my name in that particular tone made something flutter dangerously in my ribcage. "I really need this. I can't explain why, but I do." Looking at him in that moment, seeing the genuine vulnerability in his expression and the way he was waiting for my answer like it mattered more than it should have, I felt my careful resolve crumble. There was something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, a kind of openness that felt both precious and fragile. "Okay," I said, the word emerging before I'd fully decided to speak it. "We could try, but I don't know how much help I'll actually be." The transformation in his expression was immediate and radiant. His entire posture shifted, tension I hadn't realized he'd been carrying finally releasing from his shoulders. "When do we start?" he asked, and there was an eagerness in his voice that made this feel like something more significant than dance lessons. "Tonight," I heard myself say. "After dinner." We can push the furniture aside. As evening approached, and we moved through the familiar ritual of preparing a simple meal together, I understood that I'd just agreed to something that would fundamentally alter the careful equilibrium we'd maintained. Tonight, our living room would become a different kind of space, and the distance we'd preserved would collapse in ways neither of us was prepared for. But watching the way he moved through our kitchen with new lightness, the genuine gratitude in every gesture, I also understood that I would have agreed to teach him anything he'd asked. And that realization felt like the most dangerous development of all. The lessons began that very night, after we'd cleared the dinner dishes and pushed our coffee table against the wall. The living room felt different with the furniture rearranged, larger somehow, but also more intimate. The open space seemed to emphasize how close we would need to stand, how the careful distance we'd maintained would necessarily collapse. I started with basics, try to approach it like any other skill one person might teach another. Rhythm first, I told him, putting on something with a clear beat, something uncomplicated. Just feel where the music wants you to move. But watching Nolan attempt to find a rhythm was both endearing and slightly painful. He moved with the determined concentration of someone solving a math problem, counting beats aloud and frowning when his body couldn't quite match what his mind understood. "You're thinking too hard," I said, stepping closer to demonstrate. "Dancing isn't supposed to be intellectual. It's more like breathing with the music." I showed him how to let his shoulders relax, how to feel the beat in his chest rather than counting it in his head. When I placed my hand on his shoulder to correct his posture, I felt him go very still, as if he was concentrating on something beyond the movement. The contact lasted only seconds, but it left something charged in the air between us. The first week was clumsy in the way that learning anything new inevitably is. Nolan would laugh too loudly when he stumbled, throwing himself into exaggerated theatrical despair when he lost the rhythm. But there were moments when the laughter would fade and something more serious would settle over us. Moments when he would focus so intently on following my guidance that the rest of the world seemed to disappear. I found myself looking forward to those evening sessions in ways that felt dangerous to examine too closely. The anticipation would build throughout the day, a low hum of nervous energy that followed me through classes and study sessions. By the time we cleared the living room each night, I was hyper-aware of every detail. The way the lamplight fell across the hardwood floor, the particular playlist we developed for practice, the careful choreography of how we position ourselves in the space. Gradually, the music evolved. What had started as upbeat songs with obvious rhythms slowly shifted toward something more nuanced. I found myself selecting tracks that required closer movement, slower tempos that demanded a different kind of attention. Neither of us mentioned this progression explicitly, but it felt natural, like a conversation we were having without words. Nolan began to improve, his initial awkwardness giving way to something more fluid. His natural athleticism started to emerge once he stopped overthinking every movement. But more than that, he began to understand what I've been trying to teach him about trust and surrender, about letting the music guide rather than forcing predetermined steps. The breakthrough came during our third week, while we were working on a song that required him to lead. I've been teaching him how to guide a partner's movement through subtle pressure and direction, how to communicate intention through touch rather than words. His hand was firm against my back, and for once he wasn't counting or concentrating so hard that his jaw tensed. He was simply moving, letting instinct take over. "You're getting it," I said, but my voice came out quieter than I'd intended. The words seemed to hang in the small space between us, and when he looked down at me, something in his expression had shifted. "It feels different than I expected," he said, and there was something in his voice I couldn't quite identify. "More, I don't know, personal." The words settled between us like something we could both see, but neither wanted to examine too closely. We were standing close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to notice the way his breathing had changed, become more conscious. But then the song ended, and whatever moment we'd been inhabiting dissolved back into the safety of instruction and practice. He stepped back, running his hand through his hair in that familiar gesture, and we both busied ourselves with adjusting the playlist and discussing technique. Still, something had changed. The sessions began to stretch longer, extending past the point where we'd reasonably covered what he needed to know for the party. Sometimes he would initiate without asking, pulling me into position when a song came on that we'd been working with. Other times I would catch him watching me with an expression I couldn't read, something that looked almost like curiosity. I started writing again during this period, my notebook filling with fragments and half-formed poems I would never show anyone. The words felt different than my usual academic exercises, more urgent somehow, as if something inside me was trying to work its way toward the surface through metaphor and careful arrangement of syllables. Nolan grew quieter during the day, more withdrawn from his usual social routines. He started declining invitations from friends, claiming he needed to practice more, needed to perfect what he was learning. But I suspected the truth was more complicated, that something about our evening ritual had become necessary to him in ways he couldn't articulate. The apartment began to feel different too, charged with anticipation that built throughout each day toward those moments when we would clear the space and find ourselves moving together in the lamplight. Our shared living space had always been comfortable, but now it hummed with unspoken questions and careful awareness of proximity. We were learning something together, though I was beginning to understand that it had less to do with dancing than with the strange intimacy of trust and physical closeness, the way two people could communicate without words when they allowed themselves to exist in the same rhythm. And somewhere beneath all the instruction and practice, something else was growing, something neither of us was brave enough to name, but both of us could feel building with each passing evening. The revelation came on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks into our lessons, when everything we'd been carefully avoiding finally surfaced in a way that neither of us could pretend hadn't happened. The song playing was something I'd added to our playlist without really thinking about its implications, something slow and haunting that seemed to pull emotion from places I usually kept carefully guarded. We've been working on leading and following, on the subtle communication that happens between two people when they trust each other enough to move as one. Nolan had finally stopped overthinking every step, stopped counting beats aloud, and was moving with the kind of natural grace I'd always suspected he possessed. His hand was firm against my back, fingers spread wide across the fabric of my shirt, and I could feel the warmth of his palm even through the cotton. We'd grown comfortable with this kind of contact over the weeks, but tonight something felt different. The air in our living room seemed heavier somehow, charged with something neither of us had acknowledged but both of us could feel. The music was pulling us closer than necessary, or maybe we were allowing it to, letting the melody dictate a proximity that had nothing to do with proper dance technique. I could feel his breath against my temple, could smell the faint scent of whatever soap he used mixed with something that was purely him. My hand rested on his shoulder, and I could feel the tension there, the way his muscles had gone very still, as if he was concentrating on something beyond the movement. We were barely moving now, swaying more than dancing, caught in a rhythm that felt dangerous and inevitable. The song seemed to stretch endlessly, each note hanging in the air between us like a question neither of us knew how to answer. I should have stepped back, should have made some joke about the tempo being too slow for practice, should have done anything to break whatever spell was settling over us. Instead, I found myself looking up at him, meeting his eyes in a way that felt both natural and terrifying. He was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before, something intense and searching, as if he was trying to understand something he'd never had to examine until now. "You make this feel different," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper, so quiet I almost wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. The words hung between us like something physical, something we could both see and neither could take back. "Different how?" I asked, though part of me knew I shouldn't, knew that pursuing this conversation would take us in a territory we'd been carefully avoiding for weeks. He was quiet for a long moment, his hand still firm against my back, still holding me in place, even though the song had ended and we had no excuse to remain this close. I could see him wrestling with something, could see the exact moment when his usual careful composure began to crack. "Like it matters," he said finally. Like it's not just about learning steps or impressing people at some party. Like it's about. He trailed off, searching for words that didn't seem to exist, his forehead creasing with the effort of trying to articulate something he'd never had to put into language before. About what? I pressed, even though my heart was beating so hard I was sure he could feel it where his chest almost touched mine. About you, he said, and the words came out like a confession, like something he'd been carrying for weeks without realizing it. About the way you move. About how, when I'm close to you like this, I can't think about anything else. The admission settled between us like something fragile and dangerous, and I felt my breath catch in a way that probably gave away everything I'd been trying to hide. We were still swaying slightly, still caught in the momentum of movement, even though the music had shifted to something else entirely. Nolan, I started, but I didn't know what I intended to say, didn't know whether I was going to warn him away from whatever precipice we were approaching or confess that I've been feeling the same impossible pull for months. I know I shouldn't be saying this, he continued, his voice gaining strength even as his words became more dangerous. I know it doesn't make sense, but when I'm here with you like this, when you're teaching me to move and trust and just be present in my own body, it feels like the most honest thing I've ever done. His other hand came up to rest against my cheek, a gesture so gentle and unexpected that I felt something break open in my chest. The careful distance we'd maintained, the boundaries we'd never discussed but both understood, dissolved completely in that moment. I don't know what this means, he said, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone in a way that made my eyes flutter closed. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with feeling this way about you, but I can't pretend it's not happening anymore. When I opened my eyes, he was looking at me with such raw honesty that I felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with the physical closeness between us. This was Nolan stripped of all his usual confidence and easy charm, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen him before. The next song on our playlist began, something even slower than what had been playing before, but neither of us moved to change it. We just stood there in our living room, foreheads almost touching, breathing the same air and trying to process what had just shifted between us. I should have said something then, should have either stepped away or stepped closer, should have made some choice about what this moment meant for both of us. Instead, I just let myself exist in the space between one breath and the next, caught in the impossibility of something I'd wanted for months, but never dared to hope could be mutual. The silence stretched between us, heavy with possibility and fear in equal measure, while the music played on and the lamplight continued to cast shadows across our familiar living room that had suddenly become the site of something entirely new. The days that followed were filled with a particular kind of tension that made our apartment feel simultaneously too small and impossibly vast. Nolan retreated into himself in ways I'd never seen before, disappearing for hours at a time without explanation, his usual easy presence replaced by something careful and distant. When we crossed paths in the kitchen or hallway, he would offer polite smiles that felt like apologies for something neither of us could name. The dance lessons stopped abruptly. The living room remained in its usual configuration. Coffee table returned to its familiar position. No evidence remaining of the evenings we'd spent learning to move together in the lamplight. It was as if that Tuesday night had been erased, except for the way the silence between us had changed quality, become heavy with things we'd acknowledged, but couldn't take back. I threw myself into schoolwork with desperate focus, spending long hours in the library where I wouldn't have to navigate the complicated choreography of avoiding someone in a shared space. My notebook filled with analyses of unrequited love in Victorian poetry, academic examinations of longing and desire that felt safer than acknowledging the real longing that had taken up residence in my chest. But late at night, when I thought he was asleep, I could hear him moving restlessly in his room, could hear the particular rhythm of pacing that meant he was wrestling with something too large for the confines of sleep. Sometimes I would lie awake listening to those sounds, wondering if he was thinking about the same moment that had been playing on repeat in my mind, wondering if his confession had felt as earth-shifting to him as it had to me. The party at Sarah's approached like a deadline neither of us mentioned. I knew it was weighing on him, could see the anxiety building in the way he carried himself, the return of that particular tension he'd had before our lessons began. But asking about it would have required acknowledging everything we were both trying to pretend hadn't happened. The breaking point came on a Thursday night, nearly 2 weeks after our last dance lesson. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table, supposedly working on a paper about subtext and hidden meaning in modernist literature, when Nolan appeared in the doorway. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well, shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before, and there was something fragile about the way he held himself. "I went to the party," he said without preamble, and his voice carried a flatness I'd never heard from him before. I looked up from my laptop, surprised both by his sudden appearance and the information he was sharing. Sarah's party had been the previous Friday, but he'd never mentioned whether he'd actually gone, and I'd been too caught up in my own avoidance to ask. "How was it?" I asked, though something in his expression suggested it hadn't gone well. He laughed, but it was a sound entirely devoid of humor. "Terrible," he said. "I spent the whole night standing against the wall, watching other people dance and thinking about." He stopped himself, running his hand through his hair in that gesture I'd memorized, but this time it looked more like desperation than habit. "Thinking about what?" I pressed, though part of me already knew what he was going to say. "About you," he said, and the words came out like he was admitting defeat. "About how different it felt when you were teaching me. About how I couldn't stop watching other people move together and wishing I was back in our living room with you instead." He moved further into the kitchen, close enough that I could see the exhaustion in his features, the way this confession was costing him something. "I tried to dance with Sarah," he continued. "Try to pretend that everything was normal, that I was just there to have a good time like everyone else. But every time she got close, every time she tried to pull me into the music, all I could think about was how wrong it felt." The admission hung between us like something fragile and dangerous, and I felt my careful composure beginning to crack. All the distance I'd been maintaining, all the academic analysis I'd been hiding behind, felt suddenly inadequate in the face of his raw honesty. "Wrong how?" I asked, though my voice came out quieter than I'd intended. "Like I was pretending to be someone I'm not," he said. "Like I was going through the motions of being the person everyone expects me to be, but it felt hollow, empty." He sat down across from me at the table, and suddenly we were closer than we'd been since that night in the living room. I could see the conflict in his expression, the way he was wrestling with something that went far deeper than anxiety about a party or learning to dance. "I've been thinking about what I said to you," he continued, "about what it means that being close to you feels more real than anything else in my life. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that, Caleb. I don't know how to be the person who feels this way about his male roommate." The last words came out like they'd been dragged from somewhere deep inside him, and I could see how much it cost him to voice them. This was Nolan confronting something about himself he'd never had to examine before, something that challenged every assumption he'd made about who he was and what he wanted. I reached across the table without thinking, covering his hand with mine in a gesture that felt both natural and terrifying. His fingers were cold, and I could feel the slight tremor that ran through them at the contact. "You don't have to figure it all out at once," I said, though my own voice was unsteady with the magnitude of what we were finally acknowledging. "You don't have to have answers to everything right now." He looked down at our joined hands, and something in his expression shifted, as if seeing the physical evidence of connection made something click into place. When he looked back up at me, there was a different quality to his gaze, something that looked almost like relief. "I don't want to just teach you how to dance," I said, the words emerging before I could consider their implications. The confession I'd been carrying for months finally found voice, simple and honest, and terrifying in its directness. The silence that followed felt different from all the careful avoidance we'd been practicing. This was the silence of two people finally standing at the edge of something they'd been circling for months, finally brave enough to acknowledge what had been building between them in the lamplight of our living room. The final scene unfolded not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the kind of quiet certainty that settles over two people who have finally stopped running for what they both understand to be true. We moved from the kitchen to the living room without discussing it, drawn by some shared instinct toward the space where everything had begun. The coffee table remained in its usual position, but neither of us moved to push it aside. This wasn't about dancing anymore, not in the way we'd been pretending it was for weeks. This was about something simpler and more complex. Two people choosing to exist honestly in the same space, finally allowing themselves to acknowledge what had been building between them in all those evening lessons. Nolan sat on the couch, and I settled beside him, close enough that our knees touched, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. The lamp cast the same amber light it always had, but everything felt different now, charged with possibility instead of careful avoidance. "I keep thinking about that first night," he said, his voice quiet in the way that suggested this conversation was happening in sacred space. "When I came home and found you dancing in the kitchen, you looked so free, like you were exactly where you belonged, doing exactly what you were meant to be doing." I remembered that moment, the embarrassment of being caught in something private, the way his expression had been unreadable when he'd asked me to teach him. Now I understood that he'd been seeing something I hadn't recognized in myself, something that had drawn him forward into territory neither of us had been prepared to navigate. "I think I knew then," he continued, running his hand through his hair in that gesture that had become so familiar, but this time it seemed less like nervous habit and more like wonder at his own realization. I didn't understand what I was feeling, but I knew I wanted to be part of whatever that was. That freedom, that honesty. The admission settled between us like something precious and fragile. All those weeks of lessons, of learning to trust each other's movement and rhythm, had been about this, learning to trust something deeper than steps and technique, learning to trust the pull toward honesty even when it challenged everything he'd thought he knew about himself. "What happens now?" I asked, because even though we'd finally acknowledged what existed between us, the future still felt uncertain, filled with questions neither of us had answers for. Nolan was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands in his lap. When he looked up at me, there was something different in his expression, something that looked like peace settling over features that had been tense with conflict for weeks. "I don't know," he said, and there was something almost liberating in his honesty. "I don't know what this makes me, or what it means about everything I thought I understood about myself. But I know that being close to you feels more real than anything else in my life." He reached for my hand then, the same gesture he'd made countless times during our dance lessons. But this time there was no pretense of instruction or technique. This was simply Nolan choosing to connect, choosing to reach across the space between us with intention and tenderness. "I know I want to figure it out with you," he said. "Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I want to explore it honestly. No more pretending it's just about dancing or parties or anything other than what it actually is." The words hung in the air between us, simple and complex in equal measure. This wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of forever. This was something more tentative and perhaps more honest. Two people choosing to move forward together into uncertainty, choosing trust over fear. I shifted closer to him on the couch, close enough that our foreheads almost touched, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his eyes that I'd never noticed before. There was no music playing, no rhythm to follow except the shared cadence of our breathing, but it felt like the most natural dance we'd ever shared. "You know, we don't have to have all the answers right now," I said, echoing the words I'd offered him in the kitchen, but this time they felt less like comfort and more like promise. "We could just be here. We could just see what happens when we stop trying to define everything and just let ourselves exist in this." He smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in weeks, and something in my chest loosened with relief. This was the Nolan I'd been missing, not the careful, distant version who'd been navigating around what we couldn't discuss, but the open, vulnerable person who'd been brave enough to ask me to teach him something I'd never taught anyone. We stayed like that as the evening deepened around us, not moving apart even when conversation faded into comfortable silence. The apartment settled into its familiar quiet, but the quality of that silence had changed. It was no longer filled with things we couldn't say, but with the peaceful awareness of two people who had finally allowed themselves to exist honestly in each other's presence. When we finally stood to turn off the lamp and head to our separate rooms, Nolan paused in the doorway, looking back at me with an expression that carried both gratitude and anticipation. "Tomorrow?" he asked, and though the question was simple, I understood he was asking about more than just the next day. He was asking if I would continue choosing this uncertain path with him, if I would keep showing up for whatever we were building together. "Tomorrow," I confirmed, and the word felt like a promise, like the beginning of something we would learn to navigate together, one honest moment at a time. In the darkness of our shared apartment, finally free from the weight of things unsaid, we both understood that we had found our way to something rare and precious. The courage to exist authentically with another person, to move forward into uncertainty with trust and tenderness as our only guides.